All right, okay, it doesn't matter. So, well, I'd like to welcome everyone to the first event of our contemplative path through the crisis, to today's Inter-Contemplative dialogue with Alan Wallace and Eva Netanya. We're keeping good social distance because we're about 4,000 or 5,000 miles apart from each other, but very close in spirit and in friendship. And I'd like to welcome you all on behalf of the 9 of us who are living the contemplative life here in Bonvo, some of them behind me here. I have to sit very close to the screen for audio reasons, but we're very happy to be able to host this first event in the contemplative path here from Bonvo. We're here in a beautiful spring season, just opening. The trees are greening. In the last couple of days, it's been very warm. Nature is springing into springtime. And last night we had our first meditation in the barn, which is our new conference space. And this is where we were going to be with Alan and Eva for the dialogue, but because it had to be postponed, we weren't able to be there, of course. But we had our first meditation in the barn last night, the spring equinox, and we danced and said Mass and welcomed in the new year of the new sun. March the 21st is also a monastic feast commemorating the death and the birth into heaven of Saint Benedict. So we're very conscious here of both the beauty and the regenerative power of these elemental forces of nature, a nature that we have not loved very well or cared for very well as human stewards in the past few decades especially. But the equinox is the power of resurrection in nature, life coming out of the death of winter. So it's a very good day for us, I think, to begin our contemplative path through this crisis. And many of you have responded already. We only launched it a couple of days ago, but we've had a very good, warm response. And many of you have said how happy you are to feel this way of connecting with others during a time where many people, of course, are feeling isolated or even quarantined. So we very happy to be able to extend a hand, recently washed, I have to say, digital hand anyway, to all of you wherever you may be. It's especially hard, I think, for people to be socially distanced, and isolated or quarantined during this time, and separated from their family or older members of their family. So we want today to extend a very special welcome to those who are feeling lonely or anxious or frightened today. One of the Desert Fathers said, "Life and death lie with our neighbor." And the Desert Fathers were very conscious of the power of solitude, but it was out of that solitude where we discover our uniqueness and embrace it, that we discover how closely interrelated we are with each other. So we hope that our spiritual reflection and our meditation together will begin shortly with a dialogue and exchange. It's a conversation, we don't have a script, so we will see where we are led. I'm sure we won't have any long periods where we're thinking of something to say, but in case we do, I have a list of little bombs here, little quotes that I can throw out, but I don't think we'll need them. But we hope that our conversation today and the meditation which will conclude it will bring each of you a sense of connection with yourself and with each other, and even with the mysterious but the real meaning that is hidden in this time of suffering during this epidemic. So may we be friends, and may we sense the opportunity to grow today and in the other sessions that we'll be having during the week in wisdom and in love. It was, as I was about to come down here, I saw this picture, which I keep in my room, and some of you will certainly notice, will be able to recognize two. Can you see it? Is that okay? Two of the people in the picture, His Holiness the Dalai Lama in the middle, and John Main. You may not recognize the third person on the other side of the Dalai Lama, but if you can't work out who it is, I'll tell you, it was taken 40 years ago. It was when the Dalai Lama came to visit us in our very new community in Montreal. We were in our small house then, just before we moved to the bigger place. And it was the beginning of a long and rich dialogue, both with His Holiness, but increasingly with other parts of the Buddhist world. And as part of that tradition of internal dialogue, my friendship with Alan has flourished in many ways over many years, and produced some wonderful moments and a deepening friendship. And I'm really happy to be able to welcome Eva to this to today. The first time I think that Eva's been part of one of these dialogues, but I'm sure will be a frequent partner. So the purpose of the dialogue is not just to generate ideas for their own sake, but to be better able also to live better, and to live through this, particularly through this time of crisis, which has a lot of suffering, a lot of anxiety, a lot of sadness, but at the same time has, I think we all sense this somehow, an important message for us. It's an important opportunity to reflect deeply, existentially, on the way we've been living, the way we've been treating our planet, the way we've been treating each other socially, politically, in terms of social justice and the equal distribution of wealth. In all of these ways, this is a moment for us to, we hope, to take stock. Now, of course, human beings quite quickly forget the lessons that they learn in times of war or suffering. So many people would like just to get back to where we were as quickly as possible. But maybe in the big design of things, the way we conduct ourselves during this crisis will help to create a critical mass of spiritually awakened, spiritually sensitive, and courageous people in different traditions, in order to make a change in the way we've been living, in the way we've been handling our responsibilities as stewards of the planet. So we really hope that that today, as the beginning of this contemplative path through the crisis, and with this inter-contemplative dialogue, that we will be able to better control our fear and our sadness, that we will be better able to separate illusion from reality, and to be hopeful as we reach out to meet the needs of others, which is at the heart of all true spiritual and religious wisdom. So, welcome to everybody. And just before I sort of throw out a couple of themes to start our conversation, Alan and Eva, maybe you'd like just to say a word briefly about how you see this, the beginning, this first of our series of dialogues at this particular time, this particular crisis.
I'll begin by responding, and then I think many people who are listening may very well not know who Eva is at all. So I'd like to request her to give a brief introduction to herself. Why is she here? Everybody knows you, and a fair number of people know who I am, and our friendship that goes back at least to 1999, I believe, you said, in Prato.
That's
so
right.
Lovely 20-year friendship. So Eva will introduce herself momentarily. in terms of facing crises like this, which humanity has been facing for as long as there's been humanity, it's a time when the outer pursuit of happiness, everything outer, the sources of my problems are outside, the sources of my happiness are outside. The Greek term hedonia, and that is any kind of pleasure, satisfaction, sense of safety, happiness, and so forth, that is stimulus driven and by and large coming from the outside. When things are going well, then it looks like a good bet. You don't need to have much of an inner life because outside it's just going just fine. And so we don't need, or many people feel, well, I don't really need religion or spirituality. I don't need to be asking the deeper questions because I'm fine. I'm okay, you're okay. But then when something like this has happened, and of course we've had so many of this sort of wars, of pandemics, economic meltdowns and so forth, then suddenly that outer pursuit looks very, very precarious. And so I think I speak of pursuing hedonia, pursuing wealth, influence, prestige, status, pursuing the good life that is out there where you can see it. We can pursue hedonia, but sometimes it's a little bit like the greyhound pursuing the electronic rabbit that goes around in a circle. And if that dog should actually ever catch the rabbit, I heard it's about 240 volts. It doesn't turn out well for the dog. We pursue hedonia, but we cultivate eudaimonia, a term that resonates through the entirety of Western civilization, and from Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, through the Christian tradition, and so on. And we find a very similar theme in Buddhism. So times like these, they encourage us to get real, to prioritize the cultivation of eudaimonia, and recognize, as St. Thomas Aquinas said, the whole point of the political life is the contemplative life. And by political, I understand this to be not just politics, of course, but the pursuit of happiness out there, hedonia. And we need food, shelter, clothing. We need these requisites, hedonia. But then we can ask, what's it all for? Just more of the same? Or is it for something categorically different? And I utterly embrace this theme from Thomas Aquinas, which I see echoed throughout history, through the wisdom traditions of the world. The whole point is the cultivation of eudaimonia, genuine flourishing, genuine well-being. And Augustine says the highest type of eudaimonia, the supreme, is the eudaimonia of knowing reality. Of course, for him, he's referring to knowing God. So I see this as a time of a common ground, utterly common, and we're not leaving anybody out. We're not leaving out non-religious people or people of this religion or that. Eudaimonia flows through multiple philosophical traditions, and over the last 20 years, it's made its way into modern psychology. So the prioritization of eudaimonia is a unifying force, excluding no one.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, the goal of life is contemplation in the Christian vision, and it's clearly echoed in the world wisdom traditions as well. Eva, a word from the wise.
So it's such an honor to be here. I had so looked forward to actually seeing your world in Bonnevo, but I hope that will come again soon. And actually, we are speaking now from very close to where I've been in solitary retreat for the last year and a half. And my actual solitary retreat has gone on for about 2.5 years now. But I come to this dialogue with such joy, such gratitude for the opportunity to participate in something which so represents what my own life really has been for, at least 20, 25 years now, which is this union of the Roman Catholic contemplative tradition and the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. So I won't go into all the details of my history now, but I know I met you, Father Laurence, probably it was 2004 when I was living in London. And so I have deep roots in the WCCM tradition. And then
I think we first met in the Meditatio Center in London, didn't we? With your mother?
Yes. And I had been to a one-day retreat with you even before that, I think. So yeah, very, very memorable time in my life. And then I continued to pursue the study of Tibetan Buddhism for the last 15 years or so. And it's been a long, long path of integration for me. And of course, now in solitary retreat, that that journey just continues and continues and continues. And so I look forward to all the nuances which may come out of our conversation now. And just to speak to the current situation, as you asked, it feels to me such an opportunity, as Alan said, to get real, to come to the core of these meditations on impermanence, on our lives, our reality not being the way it appears when everything's kind of normal. And so when things are radically not normal, it just throws us, I think, very quickly into the depths of what the contemplative tradition is trying to get us to remember, even when things are comfortable. Yeah. And so it becomes an extraordinary opportunity to say, well, of course, our lives are impermanent, our friendships are impermanent, our families are impermanent, our place of living is impermanent. So how can we go to the core in every hour and every day and every night and let the circumstances just drive us deeper into our spiritual path rather than becoming a distraction or a sense of, well, I can't pursue my contemplative path now because too much is going on in my life. So I hope we'll continue.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I know there's another saying from the desert tradition that's the day will come when the world will go mad. And on that day, people will meet somebody who is sane and they will say, he is mad because he is not like us. So I think we're a bit crazy in the middle of this crisis to be talking about Buddhist-Christian friendship and dialogue and the richness of the differences and the wonder of the similarities. But I think, as I think we all agree, and all the people who've joined us would agree, this is a contribution to the healing of what has gone wrong with our world, and it is a small contribution to recovering sanity and health of soul. So, and I'd like to thank two masters of the universe who are not visible, but are very much responsible for the miracle of bringing us together in the internet like this, and that is Adriano Massi from Rome, who is contained in his apartment with his wife and daughter. And Adriano is our director of IT, and Leonardo Correa, who's our director of communications, who's in Porto Alegre in Brazil. So thank you both very much for all that you've done to make this look really easy. So Buddhism and Christianity, I mean, we talk about these two great phenomena. I'll just say a few words to start the conversation. You can interrupt me at any moment. So please do. But we talk about these two phenomena as if they are two easily defined monolithic things, but of course there's a huge variety of Christian expressions of Christianity and an equally huge variety of Buddhist wisdom expressions. But let's talk about them, because they do form two cultures, two bodies of wisdom, very diverse, but like the Bible itself, the Bible is a combination of many different kinds of books and literature. And Buddhism and Christianity can dance together at the mystical level. Contemplatives who meet from Buddhist or Christian traditions recognize each other as fellow contemplatives. And I think the differences between us then become attractions, actually, rather than dangers or threats or areas of competition. We're kind of interested in these differences because we already feel through the contemplative experience and search in our own tradition, we understand something deeply unifying, that we keep returning in our meditation to this common ground. So, but I thought we could begin with looking at some key ideas, or one or two very key ideas that represent a challenge to the way we express this friendship and relationship. And that one of them is the idea of God. Meister Eckhart or Nicholas of Cusa are two teachers in the Christian mystical tradition who often are accused by some Christians of being too Buddhist, but are recognized by Buddhists as soul friends. Eckhart famously said, "The eye with which I see God is the same eye with which God sees me." And for this and for many other reasons for his Christian mystical theology, Eckhart is seen as a soul friend, particularly with Mahayana and Zen Buddhism, actually. His ideas about time also, I think, reflect fundamental points of convergence with Buddhist contemplative wisdom. All time is contained in the now moment, Meister Eckhart said. This is a common mystical idea, but Eckhart conceives of it as God's now. This now is God. And this now of God is manifested in Christ. This is something specific. God's work is always done, he says, in a timeless present and is sheer love. This work of God is nothing but love, free from chronology or free from anything that we could even call an objective. You know, why did God create anything? Why do we exist? So for Eckhart, being, which Buddhism is deeply interested in, but for Eckhart, being is God. God and being are one and the same. So here's something we share in common, but we express it very differently, especially around this idea and word God. So this might sound a bit metaphysical, but it can also awaken a love of God in the person who reflects on it in the light of their own experience, in the light of meditation, and in the light of their relationships, their human relationships. So it's not just metaphysical or abstract. It's, I think, can awaken a wonder at the fact that we can know God and we can be known by God, however we express it. And that God who is love, God's self-love, in a sense, contains his love, or God's love for the world. So it becomes less metaphysical. And so I wanted to just throw out this idea of God as a point of both meeting and a point of difference, and also in particular raise this idea that when we approach the idea of God from the experience of love, both in our practice and in our relationships, something is deeply fulfilled in us. The affective, the feeling level. We're not just intellectuals, we're not just thinkers. We are people who feel, whose emotions mean a great deal to us. Maybe our emotions need to be purified. Maybe our attachments and ego lead us to make many mistakes in our relationships. Nevertheless, we don't want to become unfeeling or people, and our compassion has to have a genuine warmth about it, not just some kind of abstract idea. So over to you. God, feeling, love. In Buddhism?
I'd like to start right in the immediacy of our experience and then venture from that into these deeper ontological issues, metaphysical, existential issues. But I'll start with an anecdote. It was years ago in one of the meetings between scientists and the Dalai Lama. He was asked, what do you think is the fundamental impulse? What is the fundamental drive of human beings? And we know we've heard many speculations, survive, libido, death wish, and so forth. And I think I was probably interpreting for him at that time, and characteristically he paused. He didn't give a snappy answer and cite a book, because I've never heard that question asked actually within Buddhism. But of course, it's a wonderful question. He paused and then he said, I believe the fundamental drive, and I was interpreting because I found the right English translation, the fundamental drive is caring.
Caring.
Caring. And that is, we have no choice. We have no choice but to care. At least, and I would say we have no choice but to care for everyone with whom we identify. So of course, I as an individual, I identify with my body, with my mind. I don't want to be in physical pain. I don't want to be distressed, anxious, or miserable. And I have no choice over that. I must care. But of course, the field of my heart, of caring, is not confined, only in the case of a sociopath, is it only for oneself, and then it's ironclad boundaries. But that, together with what makes us not only human being, but sentient being, is that we are conscious, we are aware. And these two themes, you were saying it yourself, and I'm just echoing from a Buddha side, that the defining characteristics of sentient beings, that includes all of us human beings and animals, and in the Krishna worldview, the Buddhist worldview, there are many other sentient beings apart from simply animals and humans. But we all have these two characteristics in common. We are aware. Robots are not, computer algorithms are not, sentient beings are, and it's a defining characteristic of sentient beings that we experience anything at all, but it's not just experiencing, we experience and we care for everyone with whom we identify. And the ideal, I think, in all of the great spiritual traditions of the world is that we do not exclude anyone, that we care for all of God's children, we can say in the Christian tradition, all sentient beings, we say in the Buddhist tradition. And so I think these two elements, they're inextricably bound together. There are no sentient beings who are not caring. There are no beings who are caring who are not conscious. If we start there, I think we start with common ground, not only with all human beings, but all sentient beings. And in terms of God, one thing that Eva did not mention is not only she had a superb training, academic training in Tibetan Buddhism, but prior to that, quite a formidable training in a master's degree at the Graduate Theological Union in Christian systematic theology. So let's turn it over to her because she's so well versed in both fields. Eva, would perhaps you like to continue the dialogue?
So for me, of course, feeling from my late teens, early 20s, actually a very strong, visceral inner call to follow both the Buddhist and Christian contemplative paths, which I knew at the time was not going to be easy. The question of God is and was and always will be fundamental to, is it possible to be a Christian and practice Buddhism fully, not just borrowing, but fully practice Buddhism? And for me, actually, the very formal, traditional theological questions around the idea of God, as you said, the notion of God as the ground of being. And this one has always struck me, the answer to the question why there is anything at all. And so I understood, and I'm sure we'll go into this in more detail later, the Buddhist arguments for why you can't posit a separate being who's somehow eternal that then brings into being all other things. And it's a very precise question of change and time and beginninglessness. And I don't want to dive into that right now, but I do hope we will discuss it. But I understood those arguments from a rational point of view, and within the perspective of the whole Buddhist worldview, why it makes sense not to posit another being who's somehow the creator of everything else. But it's not as though Buddhism doesn't ask the question of the source of events, of beings, of happiness, of suffering, of, as it's called, the wheel of suffering, samsara, and of enlightenment, of liberation. So the question of sources, of reasons, of causes is ubiquitous in Buddhism. But the further I went, the more I realized there isn't, it's going to sound strange, there isn't a posited answer to the question of why there is anything at all in Buddhism. But that answer is at the ground of all Buddhist paths to enlightenment. And in particular in the Vajrayana, where one has more explicit explanations, guidance on the nature of enlightenment itself, the nature of the Dharmakaya, or the enlightened mind of a Buddha, one's starting to see something that is omniscient, all-loving, beyond space and time, seeing all times in one time, where the question of one Buddha or many Buddhas, while it is continually asked, starts to melt because one can't hold the conceptual categories anymore according to the way we want to think about it. And so the further I went into these explanations, these ideas, meditating, praying around it, the more it has seemed to me that the Buddhist understanding, and as I say, in particular, Mahayana, Vajrayana Buddhist, and then almost even more explicitly in the tradition of Dzogchen, or the Great Perfection, this ground of reality, ground of being, and the Tibetan word used is actually jit, which is ground. It's just the same analogical use of the word ground. When one sees it perfectly, it is indivisible from a universal, unconditional love. And so, go ahead.
No, so this would be an intuition or insight about God in Mahayana Buddhism and the Buddhism of Tibet, for example, compared with the Buddhism of Thailand, or the Theravada Buddhism, which is sometimes called the Protestant Buddhism, because it doesn't have as much bells and smoke as Mahayana or Catholicism. But would it be true to say that one of the differences, would it be true to say then that in this respect, the kind of Buddhist intuition into the ground of being as universal love, which love must be personal, that in Mahayana Buddhism brings the practitioners of that form of Buddhism closer to the Christian understanding of God, at least the mystical understanding of God, than they would to Theravada Buddhism, the more atheistic form of Buddhism. Would that be correct?
I think this is a very important distinction to make, that we don't veer to the extreme of thinking Buddhism is one great homogeneous monolithic entity. And so with deep respect, in terms of the earliest recorded teachings of the Buddha in the Pali Canon, which is very extensive, and then the primary tradition of Buddhism that is based solely on that. It is indeed the Theravada tradition that nowadays is most prominent in Southeast Asia. That tradition, I want to just kind of bracket this, and then we can come back to the common ground. But differences also need to be acknowledged and I think respected. That in this Theravada Buddhist tradition, one can characterize this, I think, very accurately, not as so much atheistic, but non-theistic, in the sense that in this view, there are said to be many gods. And they're very lofty beings. They have extraordinary wisdom and compassion and paranormal abilities and so forth. But they are, after all, sentient beings. And they may be very helpful for very specific things, more hedonic kind of things. But in terms of the Buddha himself, it is a fundamental way of viewing the Buddha, which is fundamentally different than everything in Mahayana, Vajrayana Buddhism, and then Dzogchen. And that is, Buddha was an enlightened being. He was a human being who achieved perfect enlightenment, freedom from the round of suffering, the cycle of rebirth. He passed away and he's gone. So Theravada Buddhists do not pray to him. They do not have a personal relationship with a living Buddha. They follow his final injunction, be as an island unto yourself, take only the Dharma as your refuge. But there's no notion of having a personal relationship with one who's not just died, but he's just gone off the map, off the map. Neither existent nor not existent, don't think about it. Your conceptual mind will not be able to wrap itself around what is the status of the Buddha now. So in that context, Theravada and Christian dialogue, I think there's a lot that can be done, but it's focusing on between wisdom and skillful means, prajna and upaya. There are just fundamental differences in worldview. Go ahead.
Maybe we should come down or or go up a notch into practice, into experience. But I just want to ask you both one question. You know, if you go into an Italian church or medieval wall paintings in churches, you'll see beautiful paintings of heaven, and purgatory and hell as well. But say in heaven you have all these ranks of angels and seraphims and archangels, and then all the saints. And these are all conceived of in the Christian, certainly the medieval Christian imagination, but even now, as being entities, real entities. Now, if you go into a Buddhist temple in many parts of the world, you'll see very similar paintings, actually, of, you know, looking a little different, usually a little plumper, but very well-fed Buddhist deities flying around and doing their thing. Now, do you personally, Eva, just a curious question, do you personally see them as individual or personal entities?
So there's actually many classes of beings which, and I'll speak for the Tibetan tradition right now because it's the one that I'm most familiar with at this point. There are many different classes of beings which is not immediately evident to someone who's not trained in the iconography, just as someone who's not trained in Christian iconography wouldn't necessarily recognize exactly what each representation is of. And so the main difference would be between iconographic depiction of enlightened beings, fully enlightened Buddhas. Well, actually 3 classes, I have to say. Fully enlightened Buddhas, and then what are known as bodhisattvas, or those who are at different levels of an extremely exalted path towards Buddhahood. And then thirdly, those that are powerful beings, as Alan just mentioned, that are accepted in the Theravada tradition as well, powerful beings who have supernormal abilities. They're not just like human beings. Ordinary human beings probably can't see them, but human beings who have reached deep level of samadhi, of concentration, do have the capacity to see into these other parallel realms, which are not necessarily enlightened realms, but there are beings there who, like good friends, can help us if we have good relationships with them. And so those would be different classes of protectors or earth spirits. And it's really like just expanding our human and animal realms of relationships. It's good to be friends with animals when you're in retreat. We know that. You don't want to feel threatened by the beings who inhabit.
Animals you can put on your lap and stroke. We have a ginger cat here at Bonneau that is always trying to get into our chapel when we meditate, and occasionally he does, but we usually keep him outside and he's always there. We can pat him when we come out. But my question is, I mean, a cat is a cat or a dog is a dog, you can see it. But these astral beings, or out of the natural realm, do you feel that they are realities, or are they constructs of our imagination, which we find useful? Now, if this is the case, which in a sense, where do you draw the line? Could we not also say that even our construct of God or idea of God isn't in the same way? Or what is the difference? Let's put it like that. What's the difference between our belief in God and our belief in these myriads of saints, angels, and bodhisattvas, and so on? Are they the same reality, is the thing?
I'll put it this way, and I will speak very much from a Buddhist perspective right now, and then I'd love to later extrapolate how we might apply that in a Christian context and how we think about the angels and the communion of saints and so on. And it comes right down to the Buddhist philosophical understanding of emptiness. I mean, we can't avoid it. We just have to go right to the heart of it immediately, I think, which is that things do not, nothing at all exists inherently. This is a basic Buddhist premise. Nothing in existence exists inherently all by itself. So there is a degree to which every phenomenon that is experienced and established to exists in dependent relationship with a construct, with a conceptualization by one who is perceiving it. So it is true to say that anything, we are conceptualizing the cat as much as we are conceptualizing an angel, as much as we are conceptualizing an earth spirit, as much as we are conceptualizing a bodhisattva that we've heard about and read beautiful tales and scriptures describing the goodness and the virtues of this being. And so, yes, from that point of view, it would be correct to say that when we conceptualize the ground of being, offering names such as God, such as Father, Son, and Spirit, such as Dharmakaya, such as the mind of the Buddha, these are all conceptualizations insofar as we are using a conceptual mind. But insofar as a contemplative path can lead into deeper and deeper states of meditation where that conceptual mind is not just suppressed, but it starts to dissolve. And yet wisdom can arise from a non-conceptual level. And intuitions can actually start to perceive beings, not entirely free of conceptuality, but with a lot less projection than we have at our current state of mind. Then I do have a great deal of faith in the reports of contemplatives of the past, whether in the Christian tradition, the Buddhist tradition, other traditions as well, who have perceived beings that we can't ordinarily perceive. So we could call it visions, we could call it mystical experiences. But I think very specifically in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, many of the rituals that have grown up in relationship to certain named beings who have an iconographic description, and you can look at a painting and say, oh, that's so-and-so. These are based on the experiences of yogis of the past. And then they've been replicated, and especially when it comes to the enlightened beings, there are certain consistent strains of experience, whether it be of the manifestation of enlightened wisdom, the manifestation of enlightened compassion, the manifestation of the many different feminine aspects of the enlightened mind. There's a consistency. And of course, tradition maintains that consistency. Okay. But I think when one practices, when one has enough faith to practice within that tradition, it starts to give rise to one's own individual intuitions as to what those depictions are referring to. And so the layers of conceptuality are many. I think this is self-consciously acknowledged in Buddhism. The layers of conceptuality are many, but that doesn't negate the fact there's a reality not behind it, but through it. And the more one uses the conceptuality to reach it, then the non-conceptual reality will rise up to meet one.
I'd like to give a short response.
Just we'll come back. I'm sure we're going to come back to this, but maybe we're getting a little bit to the edges of the universe, of the conceptual universe here. I want to ask you, Alan, a question based on that. You said that Dalai Lama said that what makes the world go round and what makes us human is that we care. We care for each other. If we care for each other, and in the light of what Eva was saying and what we know to be, you know, it's possible that we have that we reconstruct the universe out of our own projections, out of some complex way of interaction through senses and through ideas and through culture. But in some way, we don't know exactly that we see the same thing. or that we believe the same things. We don't really know that. We know it maybe through symbols, but my question would be, if we can trust that we do actually care for each other, we are capable of loving each other. We're loving the planet, and we're loving those who are in need of love, and we love the cat. But when it comes to loving each, caring for, let's say, because caring for is another way of saying loving, isn't it?
Certainly.
Do you agree with that? So let's say we're caring for, we're loving each other. How do we know that we are not constructing the person that we care for?
I think this question ties in intimately with the earlier question, to which Eva responded very eloquently with a lot of clarity. And that is that you are not simply a projection of my mind. It's not solipsism, that everybody around me are simply conceptual projections of myself, clearly an extreme of solipsism, but nor in our 20-year friendship am I encountering somebody. When I think of Laurence, when I perceive you, engage with you, I'm not engaging with someone who's existing autonomously by your own inherent existence. You're not utterly objective, not even to yourself. So in this middle way view, which Eva immediately addressed, we're avoiding these two extremes. God is not simply out there, Buddha is not simply out there objectively, independently, nor am I in here independently, but nor is God simply a fiction conjured up by unhappy people who want to have a big daddy someplace, or just imagining that there's somebody Buddha because it makes us feel good. It's neither simply a subjective projection, nor is it encountering a radically other who is autonomous, independent, and we somehow bump into each other like Newtonian billiard balls. And so when it comes to caring, there's a conclusion I've drawn from my meditations and reflections over the years, that each of us, every sentient being, not only every human being, each of us is in the center of our mandala. Each of us, if you turned your head around in all directions, you'd find out who's in the center of the universe. And it's Father Laurence Freeman, from your perspective. And that's true. And that's true for every sentient being. And so as I tend to, and this is one of my favorite words in English, tend to look after, care for, watch over, as I give you my attention, I'm not attending to a fiction, something conjured up by my psyche, nor am I encountering somebody radically other, but it is this mutual interdependence. You are Laurence arising to me, you are Laurence arising to Eva. And this is true wherever there's a sense of other that is always intertwined. We're always viewing the other from our own perspective. But now, final point, and that is on the contemplative path. And so this is all now straight experience. On the contemplative path, I'll speak as a Buddhist. I think of the Buddha Shakyamuni, I think of other great enlightened beings. And when I set out, clearly they are as I can conceive of them, as I can imagine them. So it's not simply encountering an other, nor is it a projection, but the deeper we go on the contemplative path, and the borders between self and other, thou and I, subject and object, as these begin to melt away, then when we come to the most intimate, most profound non-dual experience, knowing of the divine, at that point, we can be free of all conceptualization. But the very sense of I and thou, differentiation between subject and object, has melted away. And then in this regard, then we come to the very root of caring and the very root of love universally.
So, in other words, if I actually do believe that I am the center of the universe, I would be a pure narcissist. I would be, probably sitting at the top of some government at the moment. So, pure narcissist. I actually do feel and act as if everything is revolving around me, and anything that annoys me is evil, bad, wrong, and I should eradicate it, because it's, that would be extreme. However, I may also be somebody who can understand this conversation, and I know that although my ego may act at times, or incline me to act as if I am the center of the universe and everything should relate to me, I know that that is not true. That's not reality. And I know it, even though sometimes I may act under that illusion without wanting to, but I, in retrospect, see that I did something or I said something that was egotistical and was acting as if I was this kind of center of the universe. But otherwise, you know, after we've been meditating for a while, we do begin to realize that others exist. And if I give my attention to the other, to other people, to other considerations, then life, even life for me and life around me is better. It's more peaceful. There's less harm. There's less illusion. There's less damage. Less anger, and less bad consequences that arise from egoism. And yet, the other can never be completely objectified.
Right.
The other doesn't exist completely outside of myself. If I care for you, Alan and Eva, I care for you because in some way you are part of me. You have, in some way, maybe because I constructed you, or you have entered into me and become part of my construct of myself. So I think this kind of relates to God as well. As we come back to God, but we've got to stay with God too long because it gets too abstract. But you know, Saint Irenaeus said in the 2nd century, we can never know God as an object. We can only know God by sharing in God's own self-knowledge. And that, and the self-knowledge of God is the Spirit of God, we would say. So we can only know God not as an external other, or even the big other, as an object of my awareness, but only if I'm sharing in God's own self-knowledge, which is actually to be God. It is to be divinized. I mean, this is a basic Christian idea, that God became human, the Word of God became flesh, in order that human beings might become God. Not just be like God, but be divinized, theosis. So I think the point, I think, where we're coming to, where I feel we could come to, is what you just said, really. Basically, that the truth lies in the experience of non-duality. But non-duality, which means I can look at you and I can say Alan is Alan, Eva is Eva, Laurence is Laurence, and the members of the community here are each of them. But we can't disentangle ourselves from each other at the same time. And in the same way then, if that's the model that we're starting from, we could say that in relationship to God, God exists, God, the ground, the source, the goal exists, but we can't see God from the outside. We can only awaken to our interaction, our participation in the divine from within. That makes sense?
Absolutely. I'm going to abandon any notion of trying to give a course in comparative Buddhism and just go where I've been living for the last 30 years, and that is this great perfection. And everything that Irene said of God, you could say exactly the same thing. Just change the noun. Pristine awareness, primordial consciousness, the Dharmakaya, Buddha mind, omnipresent, omnibenevolent. It cannot be known. This ground of being cannot be known objectively. But where this becomes even more interesting, it can only be known by itself. But where it becomes even more interesting is that I, as this individual human being, I cannot be known objectively as the Ding an sich. When I look for myself, I see thoughts and emotions, I see consciousness, but I can't be found objectively as an Alan Wallace existing in of myself. And that very realization of the emptiness of myself as an autonomous, independent being is exactly that which shatters or opens up the way to realizing a primordial indivisibility between my own presence here and that of the divine.
I'm going to just pause for a moment. Thank you. Although we were talking with Adriano a lot about this, the technology of this, but Adriano, can we invite questions from the participants? Leo?
Yes, we can. We can. Yeah.
So, could anyone who has any questions that they'd like to raise, any short comments? I know we've been speaking at some length, but and we could begin with my friends behind me. If any of them would like to throw a question at any of us, well, you can ask. I would ask Eva or Alan, because you're seeing me for the rest of the day. But is there anybody here who would like to raise any questions? No? Okay. Anybody out there in ether? While you're thinking,
we have two questions. If you want, I can read them for you.
Okay, let's have it. Could we have the name and where they're from?
I have only the name so far. So it's Edith A.N. Pajot. She says, thank you so much for this great dialogue. Could you please distinguish to care and to love? They don't invite the same posture.
No, sorry, I didn't understand that.
Distinction between care and love.
Yeah, I repeat, she says, thank you so much for this great dialogue. Could you please distinguish, I don't know the right spelling.
Distinguish what?
Distinguish, she wrote to care, maybe she was meaning between, to care and to love.
But between caring and loving. So
yeah.
What's the distinction between caring and loving?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, good question. Eva, how would you like to start?
Okay, so first, and this is actually a question that I asked Alan some years ago, what was the Tibetan word that His Holiness used at that moment when he was asked this question? What's the fundamental drive of sentient beings? And it was tsewa, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so this Tibetan word tsewa could, in certain contexts, also be translated as love. So the dual meaning is there in the Tibetan word, but it's the kind of love that a mother could have for her child. But it's also, it could in certain contexts refer to romantic love in Tibetan language. So I think
the distinction between loving kindness and compassion in Buddhism, I think, is very relevant.
Okay.
And the caring being the taproot and these are derivative.
Okay.
Don't you think?
Yeah. So what we generally translate as loving kindness in a Buddhist context has a very specific definition, which is desiring that another sentient being have happiness and its causes. So it's not just, it's certainly not attachment. It's not wanting that person to love me. It is an outwardly directed attending to in a certain way, which says, may this being have what brings happiness, true happiness for them and the causes of that. And of course, then there's great ramifications as to what would be the causes of happiness.
But it can be self-directed as well.
Yes, yeah. And then compassion, the Tibetan words again, and in Sanskrit and Pali, the words that are translated as compassion specifically mean the wish, the prayer that another being or oneself be free of suffering and the causes of suffering. So of course they're closely interrelated, but the valence, as it were, of loving kindness is this giving of joy, this giving of happiness, this giving of may you have what you truly desire. And compassion is this kind of privative meaning of take away what you don't want.
May you be free of. So one is may you be endowed with, the other was may you be free of. But if we go to the Christian notion, as I understand it, of love, I think love would be very, very close, if not identical, to this caring. But the caring manifests when I see you're suffering, I wish, may you be free. When I see you pursuing happiness, may you find the happiness that you seek. So loving kindness, compassion are derivative of this fundamental root of caring, or one could say love.
So I think this is why in a Buddhist context, as long as one is speaking of the virtue of loving kindness, the virtue of caring that will be a path to enlightenment and is not something that leads to more suffering, as opposed to attached love, love that really wants something for me, even as it is attracted to the positive qualities of something else in a way that doesn't know all the depths of it. So the distinction between a mentally afflicted or an ignorantly based attached love in Buddhism, which is frankly to be avoided or purified insofar as, and we see this kind of the word love thrown around in modern society in so many different ways.
I think the Christian, coming from the Greek tradition, is a little kinder towards attached love, actually. I mean, because we have, as you know, we have three words for love. We have eros, which is erotic, which is I think Pope Benedict wrote his first letter on arguing for the existence of eros within God. That God is an erotic, has an erotic element. Erotic meaning what? The power of deep attraction and the desire for union and the pleasure that gives. Okay, it doesn't necessarily have to be just sexual, our ordinary sense of sex, but it is sexual. It's not, maybe it's the attraction of opposites or differences and so on. But anyway, erotic, as we understand it, this energy of attraction and the pleasure that gives is valid. And there is attachment in that. I don't know if you could really care for anyone without some kind of attachment.
Everything hinges here.
At the beginning of the process. And then eros evolves, let's say, into friendship. Without necessarily ceasing to be erotic, but it can become friendship, which is the highest form of friendship, is where we are both involved in the good, in the search for truth and goodness. So the Greeks would say, a group of robbers or criminals can't really be friends in the real sense. They're just colleagues, but they're not friends because they're not moving towards some common good or the good of others. And then the third, of course, is agape. The third flowering of these other forms of love is this boundless self-creating and self-giving agape of God. And I think those three can't really be separated. So this idea of having, in practice, can we care for anyone without there being some form of attachment, some element of attachment, which we might just call attraction? I remember once walking in Rio de Janeiro, and I saw this child, well, maybe 12-year-old child, something, lying on the ground, and I did, on the sidewalk, and people were walking past him, and I almost walked past him myself because everybody else was walking past, and then I had to turn back because there was an attraction, caring. I just couldn't be this. So then I didn't know whether he was dead or whether he wasn't dead. He probably had, had a drug overdose. And then other people were attracted, and they stopped as well. And then, of course, there was a bit of a discussion about what we should do. And nobody wanted to get too involved. But anyway, eventually we called the police, and he recovered, and was very ungrateful for the attention we were giving him. So, but I thought that moment and the different responses, the attraction to somebody in need, that is a form of attachment. You want to do something about it. It's not just for your own self, but there is an attachment there.
I'm bursting here. Definitions are so important. I've studied a little bit of psychology. There's a whole field of psychology of attachment theory, and it's something wonderful. Of secure attachment. It's a wonderful thing when you know that someone else loves you unconditionally. You can always rely on them when you're good or bad. But this is a crucial point. When we take this term attachment and we're using it in the Buddhist context and translating some Sanskrit or Tibetan term as attachment, it has a radically different meaning and a very precise one. So in this context, attachment is by nature as a mental affliction. Klesha, mental affliction, something that disrupts the balance of the mind, the health of the mind, the well-being of the mind. By definition, attachment by definition is always rooted in delusion, a misapprehension of reality. And if I'm feeling attachment to you, then, or anybody, to my dog or anyone else, this attachment manifests as I'm into this for me. Attachment is self-centered attachment. It can manifest in a romantic relationship with your dog, with your friends, your political party, but it's about me. So I will be nice to this person. I want something with it, but it's about me. And so by definition, then it's a mental affliction, and it's not actually, how do you say, incongruent with loving kindness. But now closer to what you were referring to.
It's attachment gone wrong.
It's attachment rooted in a reification of self as I'm autonomous over here, you're autonomous over there, and I'm into this relationship because I want something from you. And I see you're attractive, you're pleasant, you're wealthy, you're whatever, and I want something for you by definition. Whereas in contrast, this sublime, potentially limitless virtue of loving kindness, of maitri, is a heartfelt yearning. May you find the happiness you seek. May you find the causes of happiness, but the catalyst for it, that which triggers, opens up loving kindness, is attending to the other and seeing the lovable quality in the other.
Yes. So I agree with that. What I'm saying is that there is no, that love is a process of evolution. Love evolves. Our capacity for human love and caring evolves. It isn't highly developed in a child, but it is. As we grow older, we hope that we are becoming more loving and in the way that God loves. But we begin with attraction, and of course that attraction can give pleasure. But then we have to transcend that as consciousness expands. So we can then move to a place where we don't lose the connection, the personal caring connection for the individual that we love. We don't lose that connection, but it is something bigger and more selfless, egoless, is evolving. And I think we could say that this does give us an insight into the Christian idea of God. Mm. Because God is pretty, well, according to our ideas about God, God is very attached to humanity. Maybe there are other galaxies with other extraterrestrial beings as well that he's attached to. But he certainly, in our sense, we believe that God cares for us. But he cares for us in a way that allows us to make a complete mess of things and to wound and hurt each other and to wound the planet. So we have the freedom to do that. So even though that, we might say, hurts God. The idea that God can suffer is a very paradoxical idea, but it is one that is revealed in the Christ figure, in Jesus, in the Christian understanding of the incarnation. God is suffering, and yet all of this is held in that agape, the eternal now that we were talking about at the beginning. Is that?
I think a comment by the Dalai Lama is very helpful here, and that is, as human beings, we have biologically adapted for mothers to care for their children, even when the child is screaming and pooping and being very unpleasant appearing. The mother looks through the outer veneer of a cranky child and sees homogeneously, consistently, the lovable quality. And so we have this for our family, for our friends. So there's a biological imperative for us to survive as a species, that we must, to use your terminology, have attachment for each other, to use a Buddhist terminology, that we care for each other. But then there are borders. It's my family and not your family. It's my spouse, not yours, my group and not your group, my species and not your species. And so an integral feature of the spiritual life is breaking down the barriers, that I'm seeing the lovable among all human beings, among all sentient beings, seeing the lovable in myself on the worst of days and the best of days. And this is where that which is mixed with the self-centered attachment becomes purified, and it really does become divine love.
You reminded me that I was on a plane once, crowded plane, and this young couple came on with this very young baby. And I would have thought they would have had the compassion to put the child with the parent by the window, but they didn't. I was sitting in the aisle seat, so the mother sat in the middle seat for some reason with the baby, who was very restless, very noisy, and very annoying to me, who have this maternal or paternal bond with it. And so, but I realized that, and this child who kept on hitting me and doing other things, and for the mother, she was so delighted. Delighted at this manifestation of her child's, being. And she looked at me with this smile. Isn't that cute? Isn't that wonderful? So I think, but so that's a necessary biological attachment. That I can see that is very specific, to the hormones that exist between the child and the parents. But anyway, let's move on. Is there another question, Adriana?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
I would love to actually tie this theme of love and attachment back to the question of being at the center of one's mandala, or the center of one's experience of reality, because I think just struck me before that from a Buddhist point of view, from a Buddhist teaching, the nature of ignorance is misunderstanding what it means to be at the center of our world. And so we reify, we concretize me, and we concretize other, and therefore, according to that diagnosis of our problem, as it were, every single relationship we have is stained, is infected by our false bifurcation between self and other, and drawing lines in ways that just aren't actually there in the true nature of things, in the deep non-conceptual nature of things. And so one could almost speak of the entire Buddhist path as a process, as you spoke of the evolution of our human love within a Christian context. Likewise, the contemplative path in Buddhism is a transformation of our experience of ourselves at the center in a backward way, in an infected way, to an experience of ourselves at the center in a divine way, which is all loving and without boundary. And so it's the melting of those false boundaries that ignorance sets up that enables us to relate to others in this dialogical in every direction way that completely acknowledges the centrality of every other. so that one's own center is not an exclusive center, it's a center where everyone is center. And that can lead us closer and closer to, as you said, knowing God through God's knowledge and experiencing love for other, not as other, because I think we have to believe from a Christian point of view that God doesn't love us as other. God loves us as himself, as revealed in Christ and the Father's love for the Son.
Well, yes, except God allows us to be ourselves, which is different. But I see what you mean. This idea of let's come back to this on another day, but this idea of ignorance and illusion, which is very much related to the Christian idea of sin. I have problems with this because it's certainly, as I say, we won't go into it yet, but I'll just go into it a little bit. That sin, ignorance, illusion create bad things, painful suffering, unnecessary suffering. And yet, in a way, no one is responsible for it. We're born into it. So this idea of original sin doesn't seem to me as bad as it used to. We're born into it, and we grow out of it. We grow out of it. And we grow out of it because of love. Even though, because we are in ignorance and illusion, we often don't love well or wisely, or we love in ways that, doesn't work. So but I think it's before we go on to the next question, it's summed up in the question that they asked Jesus in the gospel: what is the greatest of the commandments? And without any hesitation, he said, it is to love the Lord your God with your whole heart, your whole strength, and your whole mind, and your neighbor. And then he said, the second commandment is equal to this. So they're really one commandment, although love God and love your neighbor as you love yourself. So we normally express that theologically in terms of the love of God, the love of neighbor, the love of self, and in Christian spirituality or psychology, we've often been very bad at understanding what self-love meant. And we thought that we would love God more if we loved ourselves less. We didn't really understand what loving self meant. If we could understand that, and I think that happened because we lost the contemplative heart of Christianity, at least in the Western Church. Because when you sit to meditate, as we will in a bit, we are loving ourselves. We are paying attention, we are caring for our self, our true self, not our little ego self. So, well, I'd like you maybe to come back to that, and if some of the people who are listening would like to send in their thoughts on that or questions around that topic of sin, illusion, ignorance, and so on, we could pick up from there next time. We'll do that. So anyone who would like to put in any questions, send them to Adriana, and we'll look at them and include as many of them as we can in the next dialogue. Next, on Sunday, tomorrow, we'll be having a contemplative mass here from Bombo, and everyone is invited, and I'll be sending the reading. Will be Eva and Alan will also be part of the teaching and reflecting on the readings that we have, and we'll meditate after communion, as we normally do here. And then on Monday we have a quiet day, and then on Tuesday we'll have another one of these dialogues. So that might be the day where we can pick up this question of illusion and ignorance, because we keep on coming back to it, and I'd like to explore it more with you. But was there another question or two, Adriana?
Laurence, it's Leo here.
Yeah.
We have a question from Mark Kenny. Is there a relationship between kenosis, the self-emptying of God in Christ, and sunyata?
Oh, okay, good question. So is there a similarity between kenosis, which is the Greek word for emptying, and it says in St. Paul that God emptied himself. And it was because of the self-emptying of God that the incarnation, that Jesus became God, made man, God, the Word became flesh. That could only happen that God emptied himself. Is there a relationship between that and the central Buddhist idea of sunyata, or emptiness, in which things don't, as Eva was saying, nothing exists just by itself, and there's other elements of emptiness that might be relevant to that. So Eva, would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, I would love to, because this very comparison actually was one of the most important themes in my early study of Zen Buddhism and the Kyoto school, where there are a number of books that have been written comparing these two ideas. But the more I've studied in the Tibetan tradition and the really Indian and Tibetan philosophical understanding of emptiness, the less that seems like the most pertinent comparison for me. And I'll explain why. Because the idea of self-emptying, as we understand it in Christ, is a fundamental idea to the Buddhist bodhisattva path. But it's not what's explained in terms of emptiness. It's on the side of compassion. It's on the side of what would be called method. Alan started to speak before of wisdom and method. And oftentimes Buddhist teachings are balanced that way, the two wings of wisdom and method. And so in the sense of this giving oneself away, and of course I have in mind exactly probably what the person who asked the question does in the letter to the Philippians, the Christ self-emptying, God self-emptying into Christ, but then also Christ self-emptying of any attachment to his divine identity in order to give himself away for
not quality, but something to be grasped.
Exactly. This is what the bodhisattva ideal involves in Buddhism, is the giving away of all attachment to oneself as a particular body, a particular individual, having any needs for oneself that could be at the expense of others. And on the contrary, reversing that. So you have the stories of the great bodhisattvas of the past, the present, and the future, but in particular, bodhisattvas of the past who have given their bodies away, literally, for beings who needed it, humans and also animals. And of course, this is within a Buddhist worldview where the bodhisattva knows that doesn't mean it's the end of me because I give my body away. The bodhisattva comes back in another body and then is able to give themselves away again and serve beings again and serve beings again. So the theme of giving oneself away with no attachment to oneself, as I say, is fundamental in Buddhism. And it's related to emptiness in this way, that if the bodhisattva thought they had inherent existence, if they thought they really were who they appeared to be to themselves, the attachment to their own body, the attachment to their own life would be too great. And they wouldn't be able to cut off a limb and give it to a lion who was hungry, with no fear for their own suffering or their own ceasing to exist. So it's through the understanding that one's own being and the other being don't have inherent existence, that the bodhisattva is able to perform these great acts of giving and self-sacrifice, which may be comparable to the self-sacrifice of Christ on the cross. But I think if in our Buddhist-Christian dialogue, because the theme is so important, if we think of the self-emptying of God as in kenosis as being somehow equivalent to the meaning of shunyata, then I think we miss the meaning of shunyata in Buddhism, because it's not referring to an emptying, it's referring to an emptiness that is always already there in all things. It's just a ubiquitous fact about reality that the teachings on shunyata or emptiness are trying to convey in Buddhism. Whereas this active, dynamic self-emptying, from a Buddhist perspective, a bodhisattva or an enlightened being is able to do so because they understand emptiness, but it's not an act of self-emptying in the same way as kenosis. Was that clear enough?
Thank you. So I would say, and very briefly, and I'll pass it on to Alan, and then we'll move into the final session, the final part of our session, which is meditation. If we could say that God emptied himself in order to become fully embodied in a human being, that is the core of Christian teaching, could we say, Alan, this is a theological question for you, but could we say that the only reason we know that God emptied himself in order to become incarnate is that this incarnate being, Jesus, did the same thing? He emptied himself. Does that make sense?
It certainly does. So the short answer is yes. In the contemplative path, and again, I'm just going to focus on Dzogchen, there's an emptying of oneself, one's body, one's mind, personal history, beliefs, all the activities of one's human being's mind. One releases and releases and releases all identification with every aspect of one's persona as a human being in this life. And in that release of all of this body, which is not a human being, my mind, thoughts, images, which are not a human being, in that emptying of the grasping to I am, in the emptying of that, then that which remains, as I release all identification with, all grasping to, I am this person, that which remains is this pristine awareness, primordial consciousness, which is then knowing who I have always been, and that is indivisible from the divine. And so, and then to tap this again, right back to our experience, practical. It's a diagnosis that we can test. What are the roots of suffering? Why are we vulnerable to suffering as human beings? And it's two aspects. One is more the cognitive, the other one is the affective, or the wisdom and skillful means. And that is the notion, the grasping to myself as being autonomous. I am fundamentally separate from everything else and everyone else. That is a root ignorance of who I actually am, and a misapprehension of who I am as thinking I am really objectively here. Therefore, you are radically other, everybody's radically other, and that sets up then all the competition, the strife, the conflict. That's one aspect. It's cognitive. The other is, it is the sense that, and now it goes back to caring. The first one is knowing, and the second one is caring. The sense that my well-being is the most important. And second, my closest friends. And third, my casual friends. And then out there over yonder, there are people or beings that may be, how do you say, in conflict with my well-being, and they are the enemy. And so this sense of prioritizing my well-being and then mine, my family, my ethnic group, et cetera, these are the true roots of suffering. So the emptying out of a sense I'm autonomous, and the emptying out of the sense that my well-being is more important than others, that opens up to realizing who we truly are and opens us up to divine love.
Thank you. Which is why the teaching of Jesus reflects what you've just said. You know, if you love those who love you, what's so great about that? What we learn to do is to expand the field of relationship in which we love. And that makes people often feel very frightened, because that means you can't love your parents or your siblings or your lover or your spouse, you know. You can't love them with that special love that gives great joy to the human existence. But the question is, for another day, how do we relate particular love of that kind to this universal love, the love of enemies and the love of, those that we will never meet, but we love them because we know they exist in other parts of the world and they're suffering, or they're in quarantine, or they've lost a relative, as many people are experiencing today. How do we love at that distance, Well, listen, thank you. We're going to move to the next session, and this evening, or it's 4:30 here now, I'm going to lead us into the meditation, and then on the other days, Alan or Eva will do that. Just before we do, and rather than make announcements at the end of the meditation, just like to say again, anyone who would like to send in questions or comments or messages, we'll look at them, and we will aim to make them part of our dialogue in the coming days. If you would like to join the contemplative path through this crisis, then you can do that by going to the website and just clicking on join now. You can make a donation towards it, but otherwise it's free. And we will then send you information about further events and resources that we'll be offering as skillful means or tools which could help us all to develop a contemplative path out of this very difficult and painful time for us all and for humanity. So if you'd like to join the contemplative path as a fellow pilgrim, then just click on that button, and we'll send you the updates. What we're going to do now is have a short concluding prayer, and I'm going to ask Catherine to lead us in a Taizé chant. That will take us, and then I'll say a few words about how we meditate here and how we can meditate. If you have your own way of meditation, I'm not trying to convert you to this, so stay with whatever way of meditation you have, but I'll explain how we do it. And then after the meditation, we'll have a short lectio. I'll take a short piece of scripture, maybe a parable from the gospel, and we'll break the word briefly together. So those will be the three elements of our concluding prayer and meditation. So maybe we can just gather ourselves for a moment. If you need to stretch a little. So we'll begin with a chant. Think of a suitable chant. Taizé chants are usually either in Latin or other languages, and they're short, repetitive phrases that we sing together. So we'll sing it here, and if you know it at home, join in. Marchen, marchen, dona nobis, marchen, dona nobis, marchen, marchen, dona nobis, marchen. Let's take a moment to sit comfortably with our back straight, feet on the ground. If we're sitting in a chair, hands on our lap or on our knees. With the back straight, in a line from the crown of the head to the base of the spine. So we're relaxed but alert. Relax the muscles of your face, your jaw, your forehead. Relax your shoulders. In meditation, we move from thought to silence, to stillness of mind, from the mind to the heart. We let go of even good thoughts, the kind of thoughts that we've been exchanging and sharing richly together just now. But we renounce all the riches of thought and imagination, as this tradition describes it, so that we can come to poverty of spirit, which is perhaps the Christian version of emptiness. So to allow us to lay aside our thoughts, words, concepts, images, analysis, and even eventually self-consciousness, self-analysis, self-reflection, to leave aside all of that, not in an instant, but progressively. We follow this very simple discipline. We take a word or a short phrase and we repeat it continually, continuously in the mind and heart during the time of the meditation. So you can take a word that is meaningful in your own tradition. The word that we recommend is the word Maranatha, which is an Aramaic word, the language that Jesus spoke. It means come Lord, or the Lord comes. But we're not thinking about the meaning of it as we say it. It's not an invocation or a petition. We're saying the word whole and entire, listening to the word as we say it. And we say it in order to lay aside our thoughts, even good thoughts. So as we say the word, we sound it and listen to it, not visualizing it, but listening to it. So we could say it like this, for example, Ma-ra-na-tha, Ma-ra-na-tha. And as we say it gently without force. We say it attentively, it's the only thing we pay attention to. And we say it faithfully, which means we keep returning to it as we get distracted. And at first we are constantly distracted, constantly interrupted by our flow of consciousness, our thoughts, our plans, our worries, our anxieties, especially at this time. But even as they arise, we let them go, and we do that by returning to the mantra by returning to our meditation word, our prayer word. So we are meditating not because we're blanking out the mind, but we're meditating because we are being faithful to this very humble practice of becoming poor in spirit, of letting go. So the word again I would suggest is Maranatha, Maranatha. So we can lead into this time of meditation now with this short prayer that John Main composed. Join in if you know it. Then we'll meditate for 15 minutes, and then we'll have in silence, and then we'll end with a short lectio of scripture. Heavenly Father, open our hearts to the silent presence of the Spirit of your Son. Lead us into that mysterious silence where your love is revealed to all who call. Maranatha, come, Lord Jesus. The Gospels tell us that Jesus taught by parables, because this was the best way for each person to find the meaning at their own level of understanding. So here's a parable about the kingdom of heaven. The kingdom of heaven is like a man who found a treasure buried in a field. He buried it again, and for sheer joy went and sold everything he had and bought the field. Let's listen to it again. The kingdom of heaven is like a treasure that a man found buried in a field. He buried it again, and for sheer joy, he went and sold everything he had and bought the field. The kingdom of God. It's the usual translation, but the better translation, that's a bit too territorial. The real meaning is the reign of God, God's influence, God's jurisdiction. Is like. We can only know things by of the divine, or the deeply spiritual, by analogy, or by metaphor, by symbol, but is like a treasure that a man found buried in a field. We can each flesh out that short description, imagining what kind of treasure it might be, buried. People bury things in times of crisis so that they'll be kept safe. What kind of treasure? What kind of finding? I think it means an accidental finding. Or is anything accident? Something by grace. And then he buried it again. This is always an interesting question to ask a group. Why did he bury it again? What does that mean? What is the field symbolize? Is he trying to keep it for himself? Or perhaps did it just simply belong in the field? When something is buried, it's hidden. But of course, he knows that it is there, even if he's not looking at it every day. And then, filled with overwhelming joy in this discovery, he sells everything that he owns. So he's not just diversifying his portfolio, he's selling everything in order to buy the field. And now that's all he has. Just the field with the treasure buried in it. Let's listen to it once more and then we'll conclude. And you can reflect on it or share it, discuss it with, if you're with people, you can continue the reading of it. And the wonderful thing about these parables is that, and scriptures in general, is that we don't just read them, but they read us. They illuminate us to ourselves. The kingdom of heaven is like a treasure that a man found buried in a field. He buried it again, and for sheer joy, went and sold everything he had. Good. Well, thank you. Thank you, Eva. Thank you, Alan, very much for starting us off on this journey the next week. And thank you all for coming to participate. I hope that we can have a little more interaction from now on. And also a special word of love from us here at Bonbo and from Helen and Eva to those of you who are particularly feeling the loneliness of this time, or the frustration, or the exclusion, or the fear that is in the air. And I hope that you've felt in this short time we spent together a sense of a deep connection across time and space, but a deep connection with yourself, with others, and with the Spirit of God, with the treasure that is buried in the field of our hearts. And if you can join us tomorrow at the same time, at 3 o'clock French time, we'll be here to celebrate Sunday Mass together in a contemplative way. And Alan and Eva will be part of the teaching that will take place during that as well. So wherever you are, we are one in mind and heart, and we send you much love. Bye.